For 3 decades, Johnny Carson served as the host of The Tonight Show, welcoming more than 22,000 guests to his famous couch. He interviewed Hollywood stars, politicians, comedians, and everyday people with extraordinary talents, always bringing his characteristic charm and wit to every conversation. However, not every interview went smoothly, and behind his friendly television personality, Carson was an astute observer who could immediately tell when something felt off about a guest. While Carson always maintained his professional composure on camera, people who worked closely with him could notice subtle changes in his demeanor when certain guests made him uncomfortable. A producer who spent over 10 years working on the show explained that Carson had an incredible ability to stay composed no matter what happened during filming. But after the cameras stopped rolling, he would sometimes admit that particular guests had genuinely disturbed him. It wasn't because they were argumentative or uncooperative, which Carson could handle easily, but because something about their presence or behavior was inexplicably unsettling. Truman Capote's ghostly presence. Truman Capote, the renowned author of works like In Cold Blood and Breakfast at Tiffany's, had been a regular on talk shows during the 60s and early 70s. His unique voice and unusual personality made him popular with audiences. However, as his struggles with alcohol and drugs worsened, his appearances on The Tonight Show became increasingly disturbing for Carson. A director who worked on several of Capote's appearances explained that in his later years, the author had a quality that deeply unnerved Carson. He would speak in an almost inaudible whisper, stopping mid-sentence for long pauses before suddenly continuing as though no time had passed. Carson later said it felt like interviewing a host who kept fading in and out of existence. During a particularly troubling appearance in 1975, Capote arrived clearly intoxicated and began rambling incoherently about death, celebrity gossip, and supernatural experiences. Instead of being the witty, entertaining guest Carson expected, Capote projected an otherworldly quality that created obvious tension in the studio. A camera operator working that night recalled that the audience didn't know whether to laugh or be concerned. Capote was slurring his words so badly that he was almost incomprehensible, and he kept staring past Carson into empty space, smiling at nothing. The interview became so incoherent that producers made the rare decision to end it early. During the commercial break, Carson reportedly told his producer that Capote sounded like a haunted house narrating its own story. When the show resumed, Carson announced that Capote wasn't feeling well and moved on to the next segment. What disturbed Carson most wasn't simply Capote's intoxication, as he had dealt with impaired guests before. It was the combination of his physical frailty, his whispered intensity, and the disturbing nature of his rambling stories. One writer present for the appearance remembered Capote telling half-coherent stories about people who had died under mysterious circumstances while giggling softly. Carson kept trying to lighten the mood, but Capote would just stare at him with an unsettling smile and whisper questions that challenged Carson's attempts at normalcy. After the show, Carson told his associates that he didn't mind difficult guests, but interviewing Capote felt like talking to someone who was already halfway into the afterlife. The experience was so disturbing that Carson temporarily removed Capote from the guest list, not as punishment, but because he didn't want to repeat such an unsettling encounter. Klaus Kinski's villain, DI'd intensity. German actor Klaus Kinski, known for his intense film performances, was legendary in the entertainment industry for his volatile temperament and unpredictable behavior. When he appeared on The Tonight Show in the late 70s, Carson encountered a level of manic intensity that left him genuinely worried about everyone's safety. From the moment Kinski walked on stage, there was a dangerous energy about him. A stage manager present that night remembered that he had wild, bulging eyes that never blinked, and he was literally trembling with some kind of internal rage. Carson, who normally leaned toward his guests in a welcoming manner, actually leaned away from Kinski throughout the entire interview. What made the appearance particularly disturbing wasn't just his intensity, but the complete disconnect between Carson's questions and Kinski's responses. When asked about his recent film, Kinski launched into a rambling speech about art, religion, and the approaching end of the world. When Carson tried to interject with a lighthearted comment, Kinski fixed him with such a hostile stare that the audience audibly gasped. Security staff were on high alert that night, and producers actually discussed whether to end the segment early for safety reasons. Carson was incredibly tense, carefully calculating how to handle this unstable person without triggering an explosion. The interview continued with Carson maintaining a calm facade while subtly creating physical distance between himself and Kinski. According to crew members, Carson later said it was the only time he seriously wondered if a guest might become physically violent during filming. Ed McMahon recalled in a later interview that Carson told him he felt like he was sitting next to a bomb that could explode at any second, and that he wasn't conducting an interview so much as trying to prevent a public meltdown. Robert Blake. Ease cold hostility. Robert Blake had established himself as a respected actor through films and the popular television series Beretta. What Carson couldn't have anticipated was the wave of barely contained hostility that Blake would bring to his appearance, creating one of the most uncomfortable interviews in the show's history. A writer present for the appearance explained that Blake came on with inexplicable antagonism. It wasn't just that he was difficult, but rather the cold, dead-eyed stare he fixed on Carson whenever a question was asked. There was something genuinely unnerving about it, as though he was mentally calculating how to harm Carson. From the moment Blake sat down, the atmosphere in the studio changed. Instead of engaging in normal conversation, Blake gave clipped, sarcastic answers, often challenging Carson's questions or responding with hostile remarks. When Carson tried to use humor to ease the tension, Blake would stare silently for an uncomfortably long time before dismissing the attempt with a curt comment. The studio fell silent, with the audience stopping their laughter and the band looking uncomfortable. What made the appearance particularly creepy wasn't just Blake's hostility, but the contrast between his controlled exterior and the sense of barely contained rage beneath the surface. A camera operator working that night remembered there was something deeply unsettling about how still Blake was, barely moving or blinking, just staring at Carson with dead eyes while speaking in an eerily calm voice that didn't match the hostile content of his words. Carson maintained his composure throughout the segment, but those who knew him well could see signs of his discomfort in his tighter smile, his tendency to consult his note cards more frequently than usual, and his physical posture that created maximum distance between himself and Blake. After the show, Carson told a producer that he felt like he was being studied rather than having a conversation, as though Blake was sizing him up like a predator observing prey. Andy Kaufman's chaotic character. Andy Kaufman was already known for pushing boundaries when he appeared on The Tonight Show as his alter ego, Tony Clifton, an intentionally obnoxious lounge singer. While Carson appreciated Kaufman's more controlled appearances as himself, the Clifton character created an atmosphere of genuine discomfort and chaos that left Carson uncharacteristically rattled. A producer present that night explained that the appearance was unique because it was intentionally designed to be disturbing. Most uncomfortable guests are accidentally difficult, but Kaufman was deliberately creating an unsettling atmosphere as part of his performance. The problem was that it went beyond performance into something genuinely creepy. Clifton arrived already in character, wearing an ill-fitting tuxedo, a bad wig, and oversized sunglasses, reeking of cologne and behaving belligerently toward staff members. From the moment he sat down, he violated every unwritten rule of Tonight Show etiquette, interrupting Carson repeatedly, insulting Ed McMahon, making crude remarks about female staff members, and refusing to follow any conversational cues that typically structured the show's interviews. The segment reached its breaking point when Clifton, apparently dissatisfied with the band's accompaniment to his intentionally terrible singing, threw a glass of water toward the musical director. At that point, Carson took the extremely unusual step of walking off his own set, leaving Ed McMahon to handle the increasingly chaotic situation. When Carson returned after the commercial break, he was noticeably tense, a rare crack in his typically unflappable demeanor. Staff members later recalled that what disturbed Carson most wasn't Clifton's obnoxious behavior, but the total commitment to the character regardless of consequences. Carson told associates afterward that he had dealt with drunk people, egomaniacs, and people having meltdowns, but there was something genuinely unsettling about someone who refused to acknowledge reality. While Kaufman himself remained welcome on the show, Carson personally requested that the Clifton character be permanently banned. George Jessel's offensive material. George Jessel was an old-school vaudeville performer whose career stretched back to the early 20th century. By the time he appeared on The Tonight Show in the early 70s, He was in his 70s and represented an entertainment era that had long since passed. What Carson couldn't have anticipated was how Jessel's appearance would create one of the most uncomfortable moments in the show's history. A writer present for the appearance explained that Jessel came from an era when racial and ethnic jokes were standard in entertainment, but by the 70s, those kinds of jokes weren't just unfunny but appalling. Carson, who prided himself on keeping the show current and respectful, was completely blindsided by what Jessel said. Instead of the light reminiscences Carson expected, Jessel launched into a monologue filled with racist terms, stereotypes, and humor that might have passed decades earlier, but was shocking to a 70s audience. The studio went completely silent, not the uncomfortable silence where people don't understand a joke, but the horrified silence where everyone collectively realized the gravity of what was being said. What made the appearance particularly unsettling wasn't just the offensive content, but Jessel's complete obliviousness to how his material was being received. As the audience sat in stunned silence, Jessel continued as if expecting laughter, occasionally looking confused when it didn't come. Carson was trapped in an impossible situation, unable to confront an elderly man on air, but unwilling to appear to endorse such views. Carson's solution was to cut to a commercial much earlier than planned, and when the show returned, Jessel had been replaced by the next scheduled guest. Staff members recalled that Carson was uncharacteristically upset backstage, insisting that such content would never happen again on his show. Jessel was permanently removed from the guest list, and the incident prompted the show to implement more thorough pre-interviews, particularly for guests from earlier entertainment eras. Divine's cultural challenge. Divine, the drag performer who rose to fame through John Waters' controversial films, represented everything mainstream 70s America found challenging. This was long before drag performance gained mainstream acceptance, and having Divine on a network talk show was genuinely shocking for that era. Carson, who was fairly traditional despite his progressive booking choices, was clearly out of his comfort zone from the moment Divine walked on stage. What made Divine particularly unsettling to Carson wasn't aggression or hostility, as Divine was professional and well-prepared. Rather, it was the deliberate subversion of gender norms and societal expectations that created palpable tension throughout the interview. A director working that night recalled that Carson remained courteous, but was visibly unsettled, keeping slightly greater physical distance than usual. His laugh was more nervous than genuine, and he was off his rhythm for the entire interview, struggling to find the right approach. The studio audience's uncertain reaction added to the uncomfortable atmosphere. Some laughed nervously while others sat in confused silence, creating a strange energy that Carson, normally so in control of his environment, struggled to navigate. When Divine made references to John Waters' transgressive films, Carson had no frame of reference and clearly didn't know how to respond. While Carson maintained professional courtesy throughout the segment, those who knew him well could see his relief when the interview concluded. As soon as the cameras stopped, Carson turned to a producer and politely acknowledged that it had been something different for viewers, his way of saying he'd been completely thrown off balance. Despite his discomfort, Carson never treated Divine disrespectfully, a testament to his professionalism even when genuinely unsettled. The interview became a watershed moment for The Tonight Show, demonstrating Carson's willingness to feature guests who challenged conventional boundaries, even when they clearly made him personally uncomfortable. Vincent Price's theatrical menace. Unlike most entries on this list, Vincent Price was a frequent and welcome guest on The Tonight Show. The legendary horror film star brought a unique combination of sophisticated charm and theatrical menace that made for entertaining television. Yet even as Carson clearly enjoyed Price's company, crew members noticed that the host seemed genuinely unnerved by certain aspects of Price's dramatic persona. A longtime producer explained that Price was one of Carson's favorite guests, but there were moments when he genuinely gave Carson the creeps. Price could be talking about something completely ordinary like cooking or art collecting, and then suddenly slip into that ominous voice he used in horror films. When he did, Carson would physically recoil, even while laughing. What made Price's appearances uniquely unsettling was his ability to seamlessly transition between charming conversationalist and sinister presence. During one memorable segment, Price was invited to read Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, with the studio lights dimmed and candles providing atmospheric lighting. As Price's voice grew increasingly intense, cameras caught Carson's genuinely disturbed reaction. Carson often noted that Price made even compliments sound like death threats, an observation that contained truth about the actor's unsettling, vocal quality. What made the dynamic particularly interesting was how aware Price seemed to be of his effect on Carson. He would deliberately play up his macabre persona, sometimes bringing prop spiders or rubber bats that he would suddenly produce to startle Carson. Despite being occasionally unnerved, Carson appreciated Price's performances and hoped he would return. Price's ability to disturb Carson while remaining one of the show's most beloved recurring guests highlights how the host could appreciate being occasionally unsettled when it was part of a performance by someone he respected. Margot Hemingway's troubling appearance. In the late 70s, Margot Hemingway was one of the world's top models and granddaughter of literary legend Ernest Hemingway. Her appearances on The Tonight Show were initially glamorous and charming, but her final appearance in the early 80s created one of the most genuinely disturbing segments in the program's history. A producer who worked on the segment recalled that Hemingway came on for what should have been a standard promotional appearance, but it was immediately clear something was very wrong. She was disoriented, her speech was erratic, and her eyes had a vacant, glassy quality. Carson, who was always sensitive to guests in difficult situations, looked genuinely concerned, rather than just professionally uncomfortable. What made the appearance particularly unsettling wasn't aggression or hostility, but a profound sense of disconnection from reality. Hemingway would begin answering Carson's questions, then trail off mid-sentence, staring into space for uncomfortably long periods before suddenly returning to the conversation with no acknowledgement of the lapse. At other moments, she would respond to questions Carson hadn't asked, creating an eerie sense that she was participating in an entirely different interview. The audience fell into uncomfortable silence, and Carson seemed unable to break through the discomfort that had settled over the room. What made this appearance particularly poignant was the context that later emerged about Hemingway's struggles with addiction, bipolar disorder, and the pressure of living up to her family name. The Tonight Show appearance captured a woman in the midst of a deeply troubled period, something Carson seemed to intuitively recognize. After the segment, Carson was unusually quiet, and when someone made a joke about Hemingway being out of it, he shut them down immediately, saying that wasn't someone being difficult, but someone in trouble. Years later, when Hemingway's life ended tragically, several Tonight Show staff members recalled that troubling appearance as a warning sign that had been clearly visible but not fully understood at the time. Andy Warhol's unsettling silence. Andy Warhol's appearance on The Tonight Show in the early 80s was arguably the most conceptually unsettling interview Carson ever conducted, not because of volatile behavior, but because of the artist's deliberate, unnerving passivity and refusal to engage in basic conversational conventions. From the moment Warhol took his seat, the typical rhythm of the show was disrupted. Carson would ask full, thoughtful questions, and Warhol would respond with a single word or a slight nod followed by long, unblinking stares. When Carson attempted to use humor to break the tension, Warhol would offer a small, enigmatic smile that acknowledged the joke without actually engaging with it. A camera operator present that night recalled that the audience didn't know how to react. Was this a joke? Was Warhol being deliberately difficult? Was he incredibly shy? The uncertainty created a creeping discomfort that spread through the studio, with people shifting in their seats and coughing nervously. Carson tried every interviewing technique in his considerable arsenal, from open-ended questions to specific inquiries about Warhol's art to personal anecdotes meant to elicit response. Nothing penetrated Warhol's affect of detached observation. At one point, Carson directly asked if Warhol even wanted to be there, and the artist just shrugged slightly, neither confirming nor denying. What distinguished Warhol's appearance from other difficult interviews was the absence of conventional discomfort markers. He wasn't hostile, intoxicated, or manic. Instead, his presence created what one staff member described as an existential vacuum that seemed to distort the normal flow of time and interaction. Carson relied on the basic human connection of conversation, and Warhol refused to participate in that fundamental exchange. In many ways, Warhol's appearance represented the perfect inversion of everything The Tonight Show stood for. Instead of warmth, connection, and entertainment, he offered coldness, disconnection, and discomfort. For Carson, whose entire career was built on establishing easy rapport with guests, the experience was profoundly disconcerting. After the segment, he seemed both irritated and fascinated, later saying he wasn't sure if it was the worst interview he'd ever done or brilliant performance art, and not knowing which would bother him more. These 9 encounters reveal that even television's most unflappable host had his limits. While Carson maintained his professionalism throughout each disturbing interview, these experiences left lasting impressions on him and his staff, serving as reminders that not every guest encounter could be smoothly navigated, no matter how skilled the interviewer.